So like Ostada Smile said, we have read about and learned about Ruby Bridges before. And I think that I may have even read this book to some of you when you were in kindergarten, or the kindergarten teacher might have read it, or even the first grade teacher. And we read a lot about Ruby Bridges because she's really special. If you think about the fact that she was 6 years old and she did something really hard, she stood up and kind of took responsibility along with her family to try to change something that was very wrong. So when Ruby Bridges was around in kindergarten and first grade, America was a very different place. White people and Black people were not allowed to do things or attend places together. So for example, for her, she had a school right next door to her, but it was only allowed for white children to go to. And she had to travel so far away to go to a school that would allow her to go there. And it was a school for just Black children. And this was true all over America. And so around the time when Ruby turned 6 years old, things were starting to change in America. People thought that was very unfair. Why can't white people and Black people be together in the same place? So they started to work to change the laws. One of the laws they changed was a judge said, hey, guess what? From now on, white children and Black children get to go to school together. Actually, they have to do it. Now, just because the law changed, there were still a lot of people who did not want that to happen. And so they were fighting against it. And so what happened was Ruby's family and her decided that they had to help people learn to do the right thing. And the story is about what she did when she was 6 years old that helped to do that. So I want you to think about a couple of things. Sometimes, right, as we're reading this story, just think about sometimes when you take responsibility for something and you want to fix it, it can be really hard to do. It's not an easy thing. You'll see that for Ruby, this was really hard. And sometimes even the whole world might be against you. But because you know it's right, you might keep on going. Sometimes people might be really unkind. And you'll see in this story, people were very unkind to Ruby and wanted to hurt her even. So I want you to listen really carefully and see how Ruby Bridges was able to make a difference. This we're going to read. So we'll start now.
I want to tell you something.
So Ruby Bridges was born in a small cabin near Tylertown, Mississippi. We were very poor, very, very poor, Ruby said. My daddy worked picking crops. We just barely got by. There were times when we didn't have much to eat, and the people who owned the land were bringing in machines to pick the crops. So my daddy lost his job, and that's when we had to move. I remember us leaving. I think I was 4. In 1957, the family moved to New Orleans. Ruby's father became a janitor, and her mother took care of the children during the day, and after they were tucked in bed, Ruby's mother went to work scrubbing floors at a bank. Every Sunday, the family went to church. We wanted our children to be near God's Spirit, Ruby's mother said. We wanted them to start feeling close to Him from the very start. At that time, Black children and white children went to separate schools in New Orleans, right? That's in Louisiana. The Black children were not able to receive the same education as the white children, and it wasn't fair, and it was now against the law. So in 1960, a judge ordered 4 Black girls to go to 2 white elementary schools. Now, 3 of the girls were sent to McDonough 19. 6-year-old Ruby Bridges was sent to first grade to the William France Elementary School, which was a school right near her house. Ruby's parents were very proud that their daughter had been chosen to take part in such an important event in American history, and they went to church. We sat there and prayed to God, Ruby's mother said, that we would be strong, that we'd have the courage, that we'd get through any trouble. And Ruby would be a good girl, and she'd hold up her head high and be a credit to her own people and a credit to all the American people. We prayed long and we prayed hard because they were about to do something that was very hard and very scary. Now, on Ruby's very first day, a crowd of angry white people gathered outside France Elementary School. The people carried signs that said they didn't want Black children in a white school. People called Ruby bad names. Some wanted even to hurt her. The city and the state police wouldn't even come out to help Ruby. The President of the United States had to order special federal marshals to walk Ruby into the school building. The marshals were to make sure she was safe, right? Because the police wouldn't even help her. So every day for weeks, that turned into months. Can you imagine doing this for months, walking past a crowd of people that are shouting and screaming at you for months every day? Ruby experienced that kind of a day. She walked to the France school surrounded by the special agents, wearing a clean dress and a bow in her hair and carrying her lunch pail. Ruby walked slowly for the first few blocks. As Ruby approached the school, she saw the crowd of people marching up and down the street. Men and women and children shouted at her. They pushed toward her. The marshals kept them from Ruby by threatening to arrest them. Ruby would hurry through the crowd and not say a word. Do you see that classroom? It looks a little different, doesn't it? She's the only one in there. The white people in the neighborhood did not send their children to school just because Ruby now was there. They didn't want to go to school with a black child. When Ruby got inside the building, she was all alone except for her teacher, Mrs. Henry. There were no other children to keep Ruby company, to play with them, to learn with them, to eat lunch with them. But every day, Ruby went into the classroom with a big smile on her face, ready to get down to the business of learning. She was polite, and she worked well at her desk, Mrs. Henry said. She enjoyed her time there. She didn't seem nervous or anxious or irritable or scared. She seemed as normal and relaxed as any child I had ever taught. So Ruby began learning how to read and write in an empty classroom, in an empty building. Can you imagine going to school without anyone else except your teacher in the building? Sometimes I'd look at her and wonder how she did it, said Mrs. Henry. How she went by all those mobs and sat here all by herself and yet seemed so relaxed and comfortable. Mrs. Henry would question Ruby in order to find out if the girl was really nervous and afraid, even though she seemed so calm and confident. But Ruby kept saying she was doing fine. The teacher decided to wait and see if Ruby would keep on being so relaxed and hopeful, or if she would gradually begin to wear down, or even decide that she no longer wanted to go to school. Then one morning something happened. Mrs. Henry stood by a window in her classroom as she usually did, watching Ruby walk toward the school. Suddenly, Ruby stopped, right in front of the mob of howling and screaming people. She stood there facing all of those men and women, and she seemed to be talking to them. Mrs. Henry saw Ruby's lips moving and wondered what Ruby could be saying. The crowd seemed ready to kill her. The marshals were frightened. They tried to persuade Ruby to move along. They tried to hurry her into the school, but Ruby wouldn't budge. Then Ruby stopped talking and she walked into the school. When she went into the classroom, Mrs. Ruby asked her what happened. Mrs. Henry told Ruby that she'd been watching and that she was surprised that Ruby stopped and talked with the people in the mob. Ruby became irritated. I didn't stop and talk to them, she said. Ruby, I saw you talking, Mrs. Henry said. I saw your lips moving. I wasn't talking, said Ruby. I was praying. I was praying for them. Can you imagine? She was praying for the mob. Every morning, Ruby had stopped a few blocks away from school to say a prayer for the people who hated her. This morning, she forgot until she was already in the middle of the angry mob. When school was over for the day, Ruby hurried along through the mob as usual. After she walked a few blocks and the crowd was behind her, Ruby said the prayer she repeated twice a day before and after school. Please, God, try to forgive those people, because even if they say those bad things, they don't know what they're doing. So you could forgive them, just like you did those folks a long time ago when they said terrible things about you. So I added this part at the end because I wanted you to see that Ruby Bridges was a real person. She's a grown-up woman now. And she was really a hero when she was 6. But what's really amazing about this story that always just kind of touches my heart is that even at 6 years old, she knew that even those people who were so unkind to her and so mean to her really needed her love. She didn't hate them. She was praying for them. And she knew that God had the power to change their hearts. And subhanAllah, you know, what she did, you know, by standing up and working against what was wrong, changed America for all of us, right? We're in a place where we can go to school wherever we want, and people can be together no matter how different they are. And it's just so much better than the way it was. And it has a lot to do with what she did as a 6-year-old. And, you know, she's grown up into a woman. She has a foundation and she does a lot of things to still help people. And she likes to help, especially children who aren't able to afford the things they need to go to school. So people can go there and they can get help. And she helps children to go to school and do what they need to do. And the very last slide I wanted you to see was just some pictures. They're real photographs that were taken at the time that Ruby Bridges. So this one in the corner with the 3 men in the hats, this is a real picture of Ruby Bridges. And these are the 3 agents, the special presidential agents, right? The president sent to help protect her, that would go and pick her up every day, walk her to the school, and then they would wait outside and they would take her back home again. And what's really neat is after about a few months, some white children did start coming back to the school, but they didn't join her classroom. They stayed in other classrooms. But by the end of the year and the year after that, people said, you know, this is silly. Why don't we just go to school? We can't just keep our kids home because we don't want them to be with a Black person. This is silly. And they all started going to school together, and she was able to finally make some friends at her new school. And that's a picture of some of the friends that she made at the school that she went to. And then down here, what's really neat is, remember Mrs. Henry from the story? Well, Mrs. Henry and Ruby Bridges are still friends, and they will often get together and spend time together and remember the things that they had done and really think about how they can keep making the world a better place. I really
Is Henry still alive?
is that she was 6 years old when she did this. That means anybody at any age can do some great things if they really,
Is Miss Henry still alive?
Sorry? Is Mrs. Henry still alive? That's a really good question. I was going to check on that last night to see, but I think she is. I think she is still alive. She's older, but I think she's still alive.
So then how many years ago was Ruby 6 years old?
Very good question. She was 6 years old in 1960. So to get to 2000, that's 40. And then another 2 years is 20. So 61 years ago. A really long time.
Do you know how old Mrs. Henry was?
I knew you were going to ask me that next. She could have been in her 20s when she was her teacher. She could be like in her 80s, maybe 90s.
89 years old today. She's still alive. 89.
89 years old today? We picked the right day to read the story.
I don't know if today's her birthday. I meant like currently.
She's older than my grandpa.
She's almost 90. She's 89.
She's almost the age of my grandpa, which is 87. But she's even older.
A little bit older. All right. Does anyone else have any questions or something they'd like to share about this?
Ruby Bridges, show you something.
So Ismail, I'm not able to see the screen all the way because I kind of blew up my screen a little bit. So if you could call on people, I'll be happy to respond to them.